Good evening, all, which I say with some amount of irony since I'm recording this at about 10 a.m. But welcome to our next lecture on the history of great ideas, philosophy. Tonight is an exciting night because we are actually going to do some philosophy. We are getting into Socrates on the Examined Life, and we are going to discuss the Platonic dialogue Meno, which features Socrates as its hero. So, just to kind of give you the scope of where we're at, Socrates, whose years are circa 469 to 399 BC, and we say circa because we're not entirely sure. So it's close to that, maybe plus or minus a couple of years on either side, is probably the single most admired figure in Western philosophy. About 800 years after him, in about 400 AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, you can say CE, Common Era if you like, but they track to the same date anyway. Blessed Augustine of Hippo is reviewing this and says that Socrates is one of the philosophers we really ought to pay attention to because he was willing to die for what he believed, something that Augustine said most of the others would not have done. Now, here's the frustrating thing. We don't have anything written by Socrates at all. We don't even have so much as a grocery list, let alone any actual dialogues written by him. Everything that we know about him comes from basically three sources: Xenophon, Aristophanes, and Plato. Now, Xenophon's going to give us a picture of Socrates as his neighbor. In fact, he writes him into a number of his works as kind of this walk-on character. Aristophanes mocks him as being so concerned with philosophy that he forgets practical thinking. And Plato has him as kind of the hero of the story in all of his dialogue, or almost all of his dialogues. Now, recall that before Socrates, the major schools of philosophy were doing that cosmological philosophy. Cosmos in this case meaning universe, so they're interested in what makes up the universe, what makes things tick. They're interested in physical topics. And there's another school going on there called the Sophists, from which we get the terms sophisticated and sophistry. You can Google those if you like. These are rhetorical schools. At this time in history, you really didn't have people like attorneys and so on, and so you would hire a rhetorician to come and speak on your behalf. Or given that we're in an election year, which again is wildly entertaining, you would have one of these rhetoricians get up and speak on your behalf, making a better case for why you ought to be elected over your opponent. So in Socrates, though, we don't get a lot of this. It's not really cosmological, and it's not primarily rhetorical. It is the idea that we can objectify the self, that is, hold ourselves up for the very first time in the history of our great ideas to critical philosophical scrutiny. And that's something that we're usually fairly uncomfortable in doing. So there's nature, yeah, but there's also human nature. And so to look at this broadly, what Socrates is going to be interested in, is discussing what is the nature of human nature, okay? So he'll tell us things like the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, granted, that's true, makes a cool t-shirt or a bumper sticker, but what exactly does that mean? What would an examined life look like? It's Socrates, more than any other predecessor, more than those pre-Socratic ideas, who perfects this idea of a dialectical method of inquiry, that we're going to look into these things with or through a dialectic. Now, Socrates describes himself as a gadfly, and thankfully we don't have those, because they're kind of like bigger horseflies, about the size of a flying dime, and they bite. So in mythology, gadflies show up in a couple of different places. So we've got Zeus, the father of the gods, arguably the horniest of the gods, just can't stick to his sister wife Hera, and so he lusts after Io, the heifer maiden. Now, he turns her into a cow to hide her from Hera. Hera's not fooled. She sends Argus, her 100-eyed guardian, to go and watch Io. Hermes, acting on the orders of Zeus, kills Argus, and Hera finds this out. She sends a gadfly to sting Io on the behind and drive her farther and farther away. So Zeus can then set his sights on some other lustful aspect. Okay? The gadfly also shows up in the story of Bellerophon and Pegasus. So Bellerophon captures Pegasus, the winged horse, gets this idea that he's going to fly up and to and around Mount Olympus. The gods will be so impressed by his actions, they will make him a god, as does sometimes happen in these stories. They're not as impressed as he hoped. Zeus sends a gadfly to sting Pegasus. It bucks Bellerophon off. He starts to fall towards Earth. At the very last moment, Athena rescues him, spares his life, makes sure that he lands on soft ground, but at the same time, he's blinded, and he wanders the Earth, hated by all humanity. Greek stories usually don't have happy endings. So the gadfly kind of shows up if you're trying to take too much of yourself. So Socrates is a gadfly in that if you're a little too confident, he is going to show up and he's going to take over and he's going to knock you down a few pegs, so to speak. Ultimately, what he's trying to do here is defeat skepticism itself. Now recall that skepticism in philosophy means radical doubt. So casting into question even the most basic concepts. Now, Augustine's going to tell us that the first obligation of a true philosopher is the willingness to die for the principles of his philosophy. And depending on what it is that we're talking about, very few philosophers are very likely to live up to this expectation. So how is he killed? He's put on trial. Okay? Socrates was ultimately convicted for teaching the youth of Athens wisdom, or philosophia, the love of wisdom, philosophy, what we're doing. As part of this, he's teaching them to question, which is something that in the Athenian state really doesn't work nicely. They've got a nice thing going, or at least they think they do. Democracy's not all it's cracked up to be, as we'll find out a little later on. And so they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put this guy on trial. We're going to say, stop teaching wisdom. And if he does it, we're cool. If not, we're going to kill him. So they get to trial, and Socrates calls their bluff. He says, do what you've got to do. Because he believed that law was the corporate expression of our rationality. And corporate in this context, we don't mean it's like a business, a corporation in that sense. We mean corpus, body. So all of us together as a body, our reason together, kind of compounded with one another, that is going to add up to more reason than we would have on our own. So they put him on trial. The charges leveled against him, in addition to this teaching the youth of Athens wisdom, was that he hadn't respected the god or the goddess of Athens, who is Athena, the goddess of wisdom. She's usually pictured with an owl. So it was really a charge of impiety. He was being impious in not respecting Athena by teaching these kids wisdom. Now, it seems, though, that Socrates was probably among the loneliest people who ever lived. He just really didn't have a whole lot of friends, and one can kind of understand that, seeing how it is that he goes about this. And so he chooses suicide by drinking poison hemlock. Because he believes that our rule of law is the corporate expression of our human rationality, law is how corruptible man, and remember ladies, you're included in this, men in the sense of anthropos, men, women, humans, people, us, might minimize corruption. That is to say, if I'm given over to corruption, but only in one specific sense, and you're somewhat better in that particular area, you might have some way of influencing me not to do that thing that I'm inclined to do. So he's devoted his life to rationality, and he's not going to give that up just because his own situation is compromised. And so he tells us the unexamined life is not worth living. So assuming that's true, how do you go about examining your life? Let's say this. Let's say you've got amazing drugs or amazing machines, and somehow you are able to spare yourself from a life of pain, be it physical, emotional, intellectual, whatever you got. Would you do it? Now, Socrates doesn't have the technology or pharmacology available to us, and so in Plato's Republic, which we're going to be talking about next, he considers instead prisoners in the depths of a cave. They're chained there. No, we don't know how they got there. No, we don't know how they go to the bathroom, anything like that. But they have objects projected on the parapets in front of them in the cave. They take those objects for being all that is real. So those shadows in the cave, they don't know it's illusion, not at this point at any rate. So what Socrates says is, behind every experience that we have, there's some room to interpret the meaning of that experience. So everything that we've done and everything that's been done to us, we can interpret in the context of how it impacts our lives. So it's the examination of those things through which life becomes worth living. In other words, life is not just the sequence of passive experiences, but integrating all of those experiences in some intelligible form, and that's what constitutes a form of life, one that is also central to a life of self-critical reflection. Now, if you're following along in the slides, on slide 18, you'll see a Greek phrase there 3 times on the slide, and it's pronounced nothe seaton, know thyself. This was what was written over the entrance to the cave of the Delphic oracle. And it is a good thing to do, know thyself. But how do you do that? You've got to know that it means to be a certain kind of being, that is, what it means to be a human being. And if that's something beyond just our mere biology, because biologically, I'm not all that different from my cat who's sitting here below the webcam where you can't see her. Say hi, Vesper. But I seem to have some things going on that she doesn't have going on. So we need to ask ourselves questions beyond a species level, like, what kind of person am I essentially? So Socrates' life as a teacher is dedicated and devoted to the kind of question, what sort of beings are we? Only after we get some kind of defensible answer on that can we proceed to, how should we live our lives? Should we live in a way such as to be emulated by others, or should we live in a way that we're kind of a walking cautionary tale for people? What's the right form of government for us? Do we need totalitarianism? Do we need a monarchy? Do we need constitutional republics? What do we want? And then what's my relationship as an individual with the polis? Polis is a Greek city-state. Athens was a polis. Sparta was a polis. Thessaly was a polis. Okay? Our words politics and political and all that come from it. So to know thyself in any meaningful way presupposes my capacity to know anything. So I can know all kinds of things and still not know myself in the Socratic sense. I can know basic facts about the world. I can know significant facts about the world. But to know myself is minimally to know. And so Socrates begins with that core problem of knowledge. How is it that we know anything? So the skeptics are going to make a claim that we can't know anything for certain. And if they're right, then we certainly can't know ourselves in any settled way. And that would mean that our life would be uselessly examined, even if we bothered to do it. So what would this examined life look like? Would it just be a constellation of prejudices and self-deceptions? Think about the last date you went on. And if you've never been on a date, well, go on one. It's a good learning experience. Now, what do you do when you're on a first date? Well, you're getting to know that person and you're getting them to know you. And in that, you're probably going to talk about what you like, what you don't like, and so on. You want to talk yourself up to some extent. You're a constellation of your prejudices and self-deceptions. You want them to think of you in the best possible light they can, or the best possible light they're willing to, depending on which one is better for you. That's not always necessarily going to be the case, though. So how do we go about doing this? What we've got to defeat is this skepticism. We've got to come up with at least one kernel of truth. I mean, just a small thing that we can settle on as true, and that will answer the root epistemological question. Remember, episteme is that Greek word for knowledge, epistemological, talking about knowledge. Is it possible to know anything? If we can settle on one thing that we know, we can declare fairly certainly that it's not impossible to know. If we follow the same method by which we arrived at that truth, well, then possibly we can use it to get to other things. So the Socratic agenda is going to be this very broad one. He's going to do battle first with skepticism and secondarily with cynicism. Now, I've been declared a cynic, and it's probably an accurate declaration. Cynicism in this context doesn't necessarily mean a glass is half empty outlook on things. Cynicism in this context means do as little as possible. Cynicism is kind of like Taoism, the Chinese religion of Taoism in that sense, in nothing is so bad that your involvement can't possibly make it worse. Okay, so you should just kind of take a step back from everything and just don't involve yourself in it. What we've also got to contend with here is our problem of conduct. What kind of life is right for a being such as myself? Should I aim at happiness or maybe just at pleasure? My iced tea brings me pleasure. What about my values? Are my values actually valuable? Are these just reflections of my prejudices? And if so, do I have any right to impose them on other people? Should you all value all of the same things I value? Well, you're probably unlikely to, at least not the complete list, but how do we find some common ground where we can start to make moral claims? And then we've got our problem of governance. The democracy of the Athenian state. Now, demos in Greek means like a mob or a crowd or a group. Krasi just means rule, okay? So the democracy of the Athenians was what we call a direct democracy. When we take social studies or world civilizations or whatever, we're probably taught wrongly that our democracy is a Greek democracy. It's really not. The Greeks would not have recognized the silliness that we engage in. The Greek democracy, being a direct democracy, would be, what do you think, what do you think, what do you think? Okay, the ayes have it. Ours is a representative democracy where we elect people who we think share our values, and then they go and vote on things in a more specific way. You can see this in your senators, in your congressmen, in the electoral college, and so forth, okay? Socrates didn't think this was a good idea. Spoiler alert, I don't think it's a good idea either. Aristotle is going to have some interesting takes on this as well when we get to him. But Socrates reserves himself the right to ask the question, how ought we to be governed? Now, we can't really answer that question in the abstract. You know, most of us would say we ought to be governed well. That's not a satisfying answer, and it really doesn't give us a whole hell of a lot to go on. We've got to approach this question specifically. We should be governed well in the following ways, and then give some fairly precise details as to what that would be. But here's the rub. We can't answer the question of how we should be governed unless we've already established the right kind of life to live. And we can't answer that question until we've settled the question of what kind of beings are we, and how do we know that? Until we've successfully defeated skepticism on a level of knowledge, that is, show that we can know things, we can't possibly have a defensible position on our ethics. And until we've handled ethics, we really can't pinpoint what our political organization ought to be. How should the polis be organized? So really what Socrates is leaving us here is he understands the interconnectedness of the long debate, that is, our problems of knowledge, of conduct, and of governance, and saying they're just phases of the exact same overarching problem. How we come to know ourselves and realize our humanity over the course of a lifetime. And so this is going to be the central agenda of philosophy for centuries to come following Socrates, and what's going to take up the bulk of our semester. So now we're going to switch a little bit, and we're going to go into Meno, one of the earliest and one of the most famous Platonic dialogues. So kind of what we're looking at here is it's a search for truth, okay? We're trying to neutralize both the sophist and the skeptical claims that truth isn't possible. Now, here's the problem. There isn't a final defeat for skepticism. Everything is potentially subject to doubt. The curtain that you see kind of over there is sort of a greenish color, but maybe I'm colorblind, maybe it's actually red, and so on and so forth. And so there's always just that little kernel of doubt that sneaks into these things. However, we do have some pretty good counters to some of the more worrisome skeptical claims. And so here's kind of how Meno goes. The dialogues are usually named for whomever Socrates is arguing with in the particular case. So Euthyphro, Crito, and so on. So Meno's been traveling, probably up to Thessaly, which had a great school of sophist teaching. And Meno starts a conversation with Socrates saying, how do we acquire virtue? The Greek word, which we'll be encountering quite a bit, is arete, A-R-E-T-E, with a little diacritical mark. Okay? Is it by teaching? Is it by practice? Or possibly, is it by nature that we're virtuous? So what Meno's testing here is, how can anything be said to be known? So this virtue, this arete, we speak of frequently and pretty confidently, okay? We talk about the virtues, generosity, justice, truth, fortitude, all of this kind of thing. But what's its source? And how can it be best understood by us? If we don't know it by direct sensory experience, we don't see it, taste it, touch it, hear it, smell it, and so forth, then we don't seem to have any direct route to its discovery. Socrates says, you know what, Meno, you got me, I don't know. Meno thinks he's got him cornered now. How will you inquire, Socrates, into that which you do not know? What will you put forth as your subject of inquiry? And if you find what you want, how are you going to be sure it's the thing you were looking for? So to put this in a modern analog, let's say that we are going to Google. We're looking for something that we don't know. What are we going to enter into the Google machine so it can find it for us? That's kind of tough. There's an old television series called Married with Children. And on this one episode, the protagonist character, Al Bundy, is looking for a certain record. And the only thing that he remembers is the song went, him. And so he goes around to these various record stores repeating that. And finally, one guy just happens to know what he's talking about. He finds the record, gets home, and if I recall correctly, spoiler alert, the record breaks before he can actually play it. But what we're getting at here is, how would you search for something like that in context? You know, Google isn't even going to recognize the him thing. What do you put in there for that? And if you find it, say it's not an auditory thing, say it's not something that you're remembering, it's something that you're looking for brand new knowledge, how are you going to know if you found the correct thing or not? So this is kind of the sophist challenge to someone who says they're looking for knowledge. So Socrates says, may I speak to your servant, Meno? He says, yeah, sure. Is he educated? Why, no, he's a barbarian, a barbaros. He doesn't speak Greek. Now, Socrates starts drawing in the sand, and he draws a square, and he transects it with a diagonal line, okay? And asks the kid questions about it. And the kid knows that the area of the square can be determined by knowing the length of the diagonal drawn through it. Basically, the kid knows the Pythagorean theorem. The square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sums of the squares of the other two sides, or a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and so on. So he knows this, but he's never been taught it, and Socrates didn't give him the answer. So the question is, how did he know it? And here we come to one of the most infamous declarations. Socrates says that the kid had always known it, and under the proper guidance, he simply remembered it. Now, this is a bold claim. This is what we call knowledge as reminiscence. This is an infamous solution to the problem of knowledge. What this posits, basically, is that all the information that I'm giving you about philosophy, you already know. And I'm just sort of gently coaxing it out of you. About 5 years ago, I had to lead a student trip to Japan, and I had 45 days to learn Japanese. Is the context then that I always knew Japanese and it merely had to be developed in me? That seems unlikely. And yet, watashi wa nihongo ga skoshi wakarimasu. Demo mata jouzu jarimasen. There's two distinct types of knowledge. There's knowledge of the facts of daily life. Doors are hard. Open them before you try to walk through. Carpets are soft. Take off your shoes and squish your toes in them. But there's also truth, that which always has been and always will be true. Now, observation of daily life yields facts to us, but it can't give us that second kind of truth. That can't be learned by experience, because experience is just the encounter of matter with matter. So the matter of my body is encountering the matter of my shirt, my Creighton polo, okay? But truth isn't going to do that, because truth is subject to flux. So how do these eternal truths learn? Socrates says the soul knows them. And remember, when the Greeks say soul, they are using that word psyche, which we should interpret as mind. How does the soul make contact with those truths? They exist in our minds as prior knowledge. In other words, they are the gift of our human rationality itself. Okay? So one of Plato's debts to the Pythagorean school is this idea that there's some animating principle in us. The Latin word anima is a rough correlative to the word psyche. So basically, that which gives you life gives you mind in this context. Now, Socrates says it predates our birth and postdates our death. In other words, it's this persistent soul sort of thing. And by repeatedly incarnating, it gets more knowledge than we could get in a single lifetime. So this is a tricky moment for Socrates, and this is something that most people really don't buy into. But the idea here is that without philosophical guidance, I'm Ryan, I'll be your philosopher this evening, you remain a prisoner of your senses and the world of matter and motion, this world of flux and change, and you can never really know anything that's worth knowing. Without philosophical guidance, you can't gain access to the truths possessed by your mind as part of your own rational endowment. So a philosopher is engaged in the search for truth of those things that can be known certainly. And this is where we get into some kind of weird territory. Okay? The answer to what is a right angle triangle is not something that I can draw or represent on paper. The answer is whatever figure satisfies the statement a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The latter is the true form, says Socrates, whereas the drawn figure is a transitory thing. So when Socrates was drawing in the sand, or if I'm drawing on a whiteboard, gosh, I miss my whiteboard, that's transitory. It's defective because I'm not a very good drawer. It's often misleading, not intentionally so, but because, I can't get a perfect line there and an absolute 90 degree, not every time at any rate, of the permanent, perfect, exact, eternal form. The whiteboard and the sand is going to get erased. The eternal form, that formula, is never going to get erased. The true form, he will say, suffers no change ever. Nothing drawn in the sand then is the Pythagorean theorem. It's just a representation of it. So if we were to perform an exercise, I tell you to please picture in your mind a horse. And you do. Now, your horse might be any of a number of one of colors, might be any of a number of one of breeds. Some of you may picture a Clydesdale, some of you may picture, a Shetland pony. These are two very divergent notions of horse, but the hoarseness of them remains functionally the same. You can identify them both as horses, even though they're so very different from one another. Okay? That idea of horse is the true form. The imperfect representations are your Clydesdale, your Shetland pony, or whatever else it is that you picture. This is what we call not an objection, but a formal relationship. The form in philosophy, formal doesn't mean I'm going to wear a tuxedo. It means it's an idea. It's a concept. It exists formally only as that form. Now, what's clear about rationality then, and what's clear about the mind, is that somehow it can make contact with truths of that sort. But we can't come up with mathematical truth experientially. That is, we're not just going to run out there and start measuring triangles until we find one that fits. Okay? So these ideas exist in what we call an a priori way. Priori. Okay? Sounds a lot like prior to, and indeed it is. What is it prior to? It's prior to experience. Now, logically, it's prior to experience because there's nothing in our experience that's going to convey these sorts of truths. Now, given that we've got these ideas, though, we must have them independently of our experience. And if we're getting a little weird here, don't worry, we're all going to come back to it. This is what we call an intuitionist theory of knowledge. That is, you know it in your gut. You've just got a feeling that this is accurate. That what's known to be true and couldn't possibly be known as part of our experience must be part of our rationality itself. It's got to be something kind of coextensive with our lives as rational beings. We've also got to note that Aristotle, when he comes along, he says, look, this wasn't Socrates saying this. This was Plato's baggage that he added later. We don't need to worry about that for now. So if the skeptic asks us, how can you say there's a thing as unchanging truth? One sort of thing we can do is point to the truths of mathematics as proof of a sort. Plato was satisfied that mathematics was sufficient to put skepticism on notice, that you got some chinks in the armor, guys. Mathematics can establish that at least some things can be known certainly. So our problem of knowledge now has changed a bit, and it's going to change several more times throughout the semester. Knowledge now is a search for the truths of things that match up with mathematical certainty. But if these true forms can't be reached by experience, what's left? What's left is a dialectical. Now, dialectical is not a rhetorical device. It's not just so we can have a better conversation. It's an investigative device. It's something by which we are going to investigate this. And through this philosophical investigation, we're going to consult the resources that the rational mind itself has. Okay? Here's the problem. Back to our Google analog. When we find the truth, it's not the sort of thing that we can just hold up and show people. Okay? It doesn't work that way. We've got to discover it in kind of the way Pythagoras must have come up with the Pythagorean theorem. we're going to engage in an internal contemplative discourse with the mind itself, this kind of philosophically introspective, we examine life, spiritually guided form of inquiry that Aristotle is going to call first things. So in this dialectic, we've got three parts. Always have three parts in a dialectic: dialogue, reasoning, and argumentation. With those three things, you form a dialectic. Now, a dialogue is simply a conversation. Doesn't necessarily have to be a conversation with someone else. Now, we're not talking about the crazy guy on the back of the bus that talks to himself in one voice and answers in another. You probably want to sit several rows ahead of him. But a dialogue, if you are having an internal dialogue, for instance, considering your options, that counts. Reasoning as opposed to emoting or becoming passionate. We don't want your emotions or your passions getting involved. We want you to be reasonable and rational. It's needed for a successful dialogue. And then finally, argumentation, not Jerry Springer throwing chairs argumentation, but argumentation of the sort that says, these are valid premises that are going to lead to valid conclusions. This approach gives us, if not a solution to the problem of knowledge, a recognition of at least what makes knowledge problematical in the first place. Knowledge is problematical because we love our senses. We are addicted to sense information. I'll believe it when I see it. I have to hear it for myself, and so on and so forth. Okay? Experience just isn't going to get at certain truths. Animals have experience. My cat sitting on my desk here is having experiences. She appears to be dreaming. Okay? People without virtue, that is, vicious people, have experiences. If my experiences are insufficient, I'm not going to gain a whole lot by asking other people about their experiences. Self-deception isn't going to be gotten rid of by increasing the number of people that are self-deceived. So we start to see that the solution of the problem of knowledge, there's already a little bit of the skepticism about taking democratic approaches to problems of conduct and governance. That is to say, if I think that something that's morally reprehensible ought to be allowed and we vote on it, it's not necessarily going to render it right. It's just going to increase the number of people who are wrong. And this is problematic, but this is also setting the stage for kind of where we're going. We're going to start to see in the weeks to come that this project is going to develop very carefully and very closely along how do we know what we know? Is that method of knowing defensible? And where do we go from here in terms of how do I conduct myself? How should I be governed? And so forth. And so this really should give us a good start. As always, should you have questions, please post them in the discussion, and I will get to them very, very quickly. I thank you all and hope you have a great evening. Bye-bye.